The void was alight with fire and ruin. Debris spun wildly between the dying wrecks of coalition warships, each one a monument to desperation and failure. The battle had raged for hours, and now it was little more than a massacre. Admiral Keldrin gripped the edges of his command console, the glow of tactical readouts reflecting off his weary eyes. The Vorthan Spear, his flagship and the last true warship of the Coalition fleet, trembled under another barrage of Zelnari fire. Shields flickered, barely holding. "We can't hold any longer, sir," a lieutenant shouted over the chaos. Smoke curled from shattered conduits, filling the bridge with the acrid stench of burning metal and ozone. Keldrin clenched his jaw. He knew it. They all did. The end was moments away. Across the expanse, the Zelnari fleet remained pristine, their dreadnoughts unscathed. Their weaponry had long since outclassed the Coalition's, their brutal efficiency rendering even the strongest defenses meaningless. The Zelnari commander had offered no terms, no surrender, no quarter, just the cold, methodical destruction of every Coalition world and vessel in their path. The war had been over before this battle had even begun. A voice crackled through the open comms, filled with mocking amusement. Admiral Keldrin, the Zelnari warlord, purred, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you see now? Resistance was always futile. I will allow you one last moment to reflect on your defiance before I erase your species from this galaxy." Keldrin exhaled slowly, staring at the fleet formations displayed before him. His forces were reduced to scattered remnants, crippled destroyers, weaponless frigates, escape pods drifting hopelessly. The enemy surrounded them like vultures, tightening the noose. He reached for the comms, preparing his final words. Then the universe trembled. A rupture in space, vast and unnatural, tore open at the battlefield's edge. The sensor arrays shrieked in protest, unable to parse the readings. A ship emerged, not through warp, nor slipstream, nor any known method of travel. It simply arrived, as though it had always been there, waiting unseen in the darkness. The bridge fell silent. Even the distant din of combat faded as every Coalition officer, every surviving soldier, every Zelnari warrior turned their eyes toward the impossible newcomer. It was unlike any vessel in recorded history. A leviathan of blackened steel, its hull bore no markings, no insignia of allegiance. It dwarfed the Zelnari dreadnoughts, its surface smooth and featureless, save for a single word etched in silver across its side: humanity. Keldrin's breath hitched. Humans? That was impossible. They were a backwater species, an afterthought in the grand expanse of the cosmos. Their technology was primitive, their presence in the galactic sphere negligible. Yet here, before his dying fleet, stood a warship that defied understanding. The Zelnari hesitated for the first time. Their fleet maintained formation, but their movements betrayed uncertainty. Scans were returning nothing. No energy signatures, no recognizable weaponry, nothing that fit within known scientific parameters. The warlord's voice returned, but now laced with irritation. "What is this? Identify yourselves immediately." A reply followed, spoken in a voice devoid of emotion. It echoed across all frequencies, filling the battlefield with its chilling finality. "Unidentified hostile forces. You have violated protected space. You have 10 seconds to surrender." A stillness took hold. Even the wounded and dying aboard the Vorthan Spear sensed the shift in the air. The Zelnari had conquered hundreds of worlds, obliterated entire civilizations, and yet, in this moment, something primal whispered at the edges of their minds. A warning. A deep, visceral wrongness. Laughter erupted across the enemy comms. "This is absurd," one Zelnari captain sneered. "Destroy them." The countdown reached 0. Light split the void. Not conventional weaponry, not the predictable glow of plasma or the streak of railgun fire. It was something else entirely, an expression of force that ignored shields, ignored matter, and simply erased. Where once had been the pride of the Zelnari fleet, now there was only absence, a yawning silence where a dozen warships had stood an instant before. Keldrin's blood ran cold. He had witnessed planetary bombardments, the deaths of suns, the raw fury of war. He had never seen anything like this. Panic took hold of the Zelnari ranks. Frantic reports flooded the comms, confusion and disbelief giving way to horror. The Zelnari warlord himself hesitated before barking another order. All ships, full attack. I want that thing destroyed. The Zelnari fleet unleashed its fury. Hundreds of torpedoes and energy blasts streaked through space, converging on the unmarked warship. The void itself seemed to warp in response. The attacks never landed. They veered off course at impossible angles, twisted aside by invisible forces. Some simply vanished. A pulse of something unseen rippled outward. A second later, another swath of Zelnari ships ceased to exist. Not destroyed. Not even wreckage remained. The voice returned. Final warning. Stand down or be extinguished. The Zelnari warlord, his once imperious voice a shadow of its former self, spat into the comms. What are you? For the first time, the human vessel moved. It was slow, deliberate. An apex predator shifting its gaze upon a struggling prey. Keldrin could not look away. This was beyond a mere warship. This was a statement, a declaration from something the galaxy had overlooked for far too long. The answer came, simple and terrifying. Humanity. The battle was no longer a battle. It was an execution. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the battle itself. The Zelnari had been relentless, unstoppable conquerors who had never known fear. Now fear gripped them. Their fleet, once the pinnacle of military supremacy, had been reduced to shattered remnants in mere moments. The human warship hovered, unmoving, as if watching, waiting. Admiral Keldrin could not tear his eyes from the displays. Every instinct screamed that he was witnessing something impossible, something that defied every understanding of war. Humanity had been dismissed as insignificant, yet here was a vessel that wielded power beyond reckoning. Even the fabric of space around it seemed different, as though reality itself recoiled from its presence. The Zelnari warlord's voice crackled over the comms again, but the arrogance was gone. Retreat. All remaining vessels, regroup at. His transmission cut off as another pulse of formless energy rippled outward. More ships vanished. There was no explosion, no debris, no wreckage left behind. It was as if they had never existed. Keldrin heard something then, a sound not transmitted over comms, not originating from his ship, but something he felt deep within his chest. A whisper, a hum, resonating at the edge of perception. He turned to his officers, their expressions mirroring his own unease. They had all heard it. The Zelnari fleet was breaking. Warships abandoned formation, scattering in desperation, clawing for escape routes. It didn't matter. The human warship flickered, no thrusters, no visible energy output, and suddenly, impossibly, it was elsewhere, blocking their path. The Zelnari dreadnoughts, some of the most advanced war machines in the galaxy, veered off course like panicked prey. One of the Zelnari captains, either too desperate or too mad to flee, unleashed the full power of his battleship. Energy lances erupted from the hull, torpedoes streaked forward. Rail cannons fired in perfect synchronization. A barrage capable of rendering moons uninhabitable surged toward the human ship. The void swallowed it. No impact. No detonations. The weapons simply disappeared before reaching their target, as if erased from existence. Then, for the first time, the human ship retaliated. The attack was silent, unseen, but devastating. The Zelnari battleship, a monstrous vessel nearly as large as a city, imploded. It did not explode. It did not shatter. It simply collapsed inward, folding into itself like a dying star before vanishing into nothingness. The remaining Zelnari forces no longer fought. They begged. Mercy. We surrender. The warlord's voice was barely intelligible, raw with panic. Please. We yield. We. Another pulse. Another ship gone. The human voice returned, calm, absolute. Surrender is no longer an option. A cold realization settled over Keldrin. This was not a war. It had never been a war. The humans had chosen to reveal themselves not as participants, not as allies, but as something far worse, something inevitable. Keldrin's own fleet remained untouched. He had no doubt that the human warship could erase them just as effortlessly. Yet, for reasons unknown, it hadn't. The implications of that choice were as unsettling as the destruction itself. The Zelnari warlord's voice was gone now, his fleet reduced to less than a fraction of its former strength. The survivors no longer attempted to escape. They simply drifted, frozen in place, as if paralyzed by the sheer incomprehensibility of their fate. Then, without warning, the human ship moved again. This time it turned, not toward the defeated Zelnari, not toward the broken battlefield, but directly toward the Vorthan spear. Keldrin's breath caught. Every alarm blared in protest, every sensor screen flooded with errors, but there was no attack, no aggression. The ship simply hovered before them, close enough that its sheer scale was overwhelming. For the first time, Keldrin could see it not as a distant horror, but as a thing of purpose. Its design was precise, flawless, without the weaknesses or redundancies typical of any known warship. It was not built for war in the way the Coalition or the Zelnari understood it. It was built to end wars. A new transmission, the same voice. You will not pursue this technology. You will not seek us out. You are not ready. Then, as if reality itself blinked, the ship was gone. No warp signature. No acceleration. Just gone. For the first time since the battle began, there was true silence. Keldrin exhaled shakily, realizing only then how tightly he had been gripping the console. His officers looked at him, waiting, desperate for some kind of explanation. But what explanation could there be? He turned toward the main display, the shattered battlefield stretching endlessly before him. The Zelnari were defeated, not by the Coalition, not by any grand strategy, but by something no one had ever predicted. A new force had entered the galactic stage, and the galaxy would never be the same. The aftermath of the battle left the void eerily quiet. Wreckage drifted without purpose. The once mighty Zelnari fleet reduced to fragments of twisted metal and empty silence. What few survivors remained huddled in shattered vessels, their transmissions garbled with desperation and disbelief. The unstoppable war machine that had crushed countless civilizations was now little more than scattered debris in the vast emptiness of space. Admiral Keldrin had seen defeat before, had watched battles turn against him, had ordered retreats when the tides became insurmountable. But this was something else. The Zelnari hadn't just lost. They had been erased, dismissed from existence, with a casual inevitability. And the force that had done it, the lone human warship that had appeared from nowhere, had left just as suddenly as it had arrived. His hands trembled as he adjusted the comms interface, trying to find the right words to address his remaining fleet. All ships, report status. His voice was hoarse, raw from the tension that had coiled inside him since the first Zelnari barrage struck his flagship. One by one, voices crackled in response, officers, captains, crew members confirming their survival. The reports were grim. Most of the Coalition fleet was gone. What few ships remained were damaged, their systems barely functional. They were alive, but only barely. And yet, they had won. Not by their own hands. Not by any act of valor or strategy, but by something beyond their comprehension. The bridge of the Vorthan spear was silent as Keldrin turned to his officers. Their faces were drawn, their eyes dark with the weight of what they had just witnessed. They were soldiers who had prepared to die, yet had been granted survival not by their own actions, but by an unknown force that had deemed them unworthy of destruction. A junior officer hesitated before speaking. "Sir, what do we do now?" Keldrin exhaled, his fingers tightening around the console. What did they do? The humans had left no further instructions, no demands, no warnings beyond the cryptic decree that they were not to be sought out. The sheer audacity of it sent a shiver down his spine. The galaxy had dismissed humanity as insignificant, yet it was clear now that they had been watching, waiting. Why now? Why here? He found himself staring at the empty void where the human warship had been, as though expecting it to return. He wanted answers. Desperately. But something deep within him, something primal, whispered that some answers should never be pursued. The comms crackled again. A new transmission, faint but clear. Not a distress signal. Not a plea for aid. It was the Zentari. One of their remaining vessels was transmitting on all frequencies. Their warlord's voice, no longer the proud, taunting presence it had been before. Now, it was the voice of a creature that had glimpsed the end of its own existence. Coalition forces, he began, his words slow, deliberate, void of their usual arrogance. We surrender. Completely. Unconditionally. The bridge fell deathly silent. Even the hum of the ship's damaged systems seemed to dim. Keldrin narrowed his eyes at the transmission. The Zentari did not surrender. They were conquerors, an empire that had never entertained the idea of submission. And yet, here they were, pleading for mercy. State your terms, Keldrin said cautiously. The warlord hesitated. No terms. No negotiations. The war is over. Whatever you demand, it is yours. It should have been a victory. The coalition had fought against Zentari aggression for years, losing world after world to their unstoppable advance. Now in an instant, the threat was gone. The enemy had been broken beyond repair. But there was no triumph in it. No celebration. Only the cold realization that the true battle had not been fought between the coalition and the Zentari. It had been something else entirely. Keldrin took a slow breath. Stand down. Cease all hostilities. Any further aggression will be considered an act of defiance. The warlord didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply acknowledged the order and cut the transmission. Keldrin leaned back, his eyes fixed on the battlefield before him. His crew waited for him to speak, to tell them what came next. But he didn't have an answer. Because he knew the truth, even if no one dared to say it aloud. The war was not over. The real war had yet to begin. The war should have ended. With the Zentari surrendering, the coalition should have been celebrating. But there was no relief, no sense of triumph. Only an uneasy silence that stretched across the battlefield like a lingering shadow. Admiral Keldrin stood at the bridge of the Vorthen Spear, staring at the drifting wreckage. The human warship had left without another word, yet its presence still weighed on the air, a ghost that refused to fade. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt it. The way their hands trembled at their stations. The way their voices barely rose above whispers. They had seen power beyond comprehension, and it had spared them, not out of mercy, but out of disinterest. The Zentari had been the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. Now, they were broken, humbled in a way no one had thought possible. But Keldrin wasn't naive enough to believe that this was the end. Something had shifted. Something deeper than politics, deeper than war. The balance of the galaxy had changed. The comms officer turned, voice hesitant. Sir, incoming transmission. Private channel. Encoded with a coalition override key. Keldrin's brow furrowed. No one outside of high command had access to such encryption. Origin. The officer swallowed. Unknown. The signal isn't coming from any known system. A cold weight settled in Keldrin's gut. He nodded. Patch it through. The main display flickered, revealing not a face, not a figure, but a symbol, one he had never seen before. A simple, stark emblem of a circle surrounded by branching lines, pulsating as the voice came through. It was human. You have questions. The voice was calm, controlled, without emotion. It was not a greeting, not a statement of intent, just an undeniable fact. Keldrin chose his words carefully. We have many. A brief pause. Then, you were given a warning. Do not seek us out. We didn't, Keldrin said, jaw tightening. You found us. A longer pause. The pulsing emblem remained steady. Then the voice returned, lower this time. That was an anomaly. Keldrin's grip on the console tightened. He had been in war councils, in negotiations with species that spoke in riddles and half-truths. But nothing about this felt like a game. The humans weren't stalling. They weren't trying to intimidate. If anything, they sounded calculating, as if they were adjusting to something unexpected. He took a slow breath. What are you? Another silence. When the voice returned, there was no arrogance, no declaration of superiority. Only a quiet, unshakable certainty. The answer to a question your galaxy has not yet asked. The words sent a shiver down Keldron's spine. He had expected deflection, perhaps even a dismissal. But this was something else. The humans had power that defied reason. They had dismantled the Zelnari without effort, and yet there was hesitation in that statement. What question? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The emblem flickered. The voice remained level. You will know when it is too late. Then the transmission cut. The bridge remained deathly silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Keldron exhaled slowly, staring at the empty screen. The war was over. The Zelnari had fallen. But something far worse had just begun. The vast emptiness of space felt heavier than before. The wreckage of the Zelnari fleet drifted in solemn silence, a graveyard of once mighty warships, now reduced to unrecognizable debris. What remained of the coalition forces held their positions, but no one issued orders. No one dared to speak the thoughts clawing at the edges of their minds. Admiral Keldron stood at the bridge of the Vorthan Spear, his gaze locked on the main display. The transmission had ended. The human voice, calm, unreadable, had left more questions than answers. Asterisk, the answer to a question your galaxy has not yet asked. Asterisk. The words gnawed at him. He had spent decades studying war, leading fleets, anticipating threats before they could manifest. But nothing had prepared him for this. Humanity had shattered the Zelnari like they were nothing, only to deliver a cryptic warning and vanish. Sir, his tactical officer said, his voice unsteady. Orders. Orders. Keldron almost let out a bitter laugh. What orders could he possibly give? Every protocol, every contingency, every plan the coalition had ever devised had been rendered meaningless in the span of minutes. He turned, eyes scanning the weary faces of his bridge crew. They were waiting for him to anchor them to reality, to make sense of what had happened. We return to coalition space, he said finally, his voice firm despite the unease in his gut. Full retreat. The words felt wrong. This was not retreat. It was something else. Something deeper. They were not fleeing an enemy. They were leaving a battlefield haunted by something beyond their understanding. The fleet moved with mechanical precision, battered ships shifting into formation, engines flaring against the backdrop of endless void. As they departed, Keldron cast one last look at the battlefield. The Zelnari ships that remained intact had already begun their own retreat, no longer the proud conquerors they once were. The message was clear. There would be no more war. But peace did not come with victory. It came with a question. And sooner or later, the galaxy would have to ask it. The journey back to coalition space was a silent one. No celebratory transmissions were exchanged. No declarations of victory sent to awaiting worlds. The war had ended, but it did not feel like triumph. The Zelnari had surrendered not out of exhaustion or attrition, but because they had glimpsed something that had shattered their will to fight. Admiral Keldron remained at his station, watching the stars blur past as the fleet moved through the void. Every so often, he caught himself glancing at the sensors, half expecting to see that lone human warship again, its presence like a shadow in the back of his mind. But there was nothing, just empty space stretching endlessly before them. The officers on the bridge carried on with quiet efficiency, avoiding unnecessary conversation. The reality of what they had witnessed had settled into their bones, leaving them unsure of how to process it. Even now, Keldron could see the way his crew moved, slower than usual, as though burdened by something unseen. Sir, the comms officer's voice broke the silence. High Command is requesting immediate debrief upon arrival. Keldron exhaled. Of course they were. The coalition leadership had spent years pouring resources into this war, stretching their military to its limits just to keep the Zelnari at bay. And now, without warning, the enemy had folded. The politicians would want explanations. The admirals would demand strategies. But Keldron had none to offer. Understood, he said. Prepare a full report. Include every available data log from the battle. Aye, sir. The officer hesitated before adding, Do we include the human transmission? Keldrin's jaw tightened. The words from that cold, unreadable voice still echoed in his mind. You will know when it is too late. Yes, he said finally. Send everything. There was no point in withholding the truth, no matter how unsettling it was. Hours passed in restless anticipation. When the fleet finally dropped out of FTL, the familiar sight of Coalition command stations greeted them. Massive, sprawling structures that had served as the heart of the war effort. Keldrin should have felt relief. Instead, he felt a weight pressing down on him. As soon as docking procedures were complete, a summons arrived. Not a standard debrief. Not a request. A direct order from the highest ranks of the Coalition government. They were waiting for him. Without a word, Keldrin straightened his uniform and stepped off the bridge, heading toward a meeting that would change the course of history. The council chamber was colder than he remembered. Admiral Keldrin stood at the center of the circular room, surrounded by towering figures of authority. Coalition High Command, planetary representatives, intelligence directors, each seated in their designated place, their faces masks of unreadable scrutiny. The war had ended only days ago, but the tension in the chamber was sharper than in any battlefield. These were not leaders basking in the relief of victory. These were rulers standing at the precipice of something unknown, waiting for answers they feared to hear. Keldrin's report had already been submitted. The data logs had been reviewed, the battle footage analyzed. And yet they had summoned him here, in person. The supreme strategist leaned forward, fingers steepled. Tell us again, he said, his voice measured. In your own words. Keldrin did not sigh, though he wished to. Instead, he straightened his posture. The human warship arrived at the height of the battle. It did not communicate. It did not demand surrender. It merely acted. Within minutes, the Zelnari forces were rendered ineffective. Their strongest ships were dismantled like fragile constructs. Their will to fight broken. When the humans finally spoke, it was not to us, but to them. He let that sink in. He had spent years fighting the Zelnari, learning their psychology, their tactical doctrine. They were not a species that bowed easily. And yet, they had fled like prey. The Zelnari have never surrendered unconditionally, one of the intelligence officers murmured. Not in their entire history. Keldrin gave a slow nod. And yet, the moment they encountered the humans, they did. The supreme strategist exhaled through his nose. You believe the Zelnari knew something we did not? Yes, Keldrin said without hesitation. I believe they feared humanity in a way that goes beyond mere technology. The way they abandoned their own ships, the way their leaders scrambled to negotiate surrender. It was not just defeat. It was terror. A long silence settled over the room. No one wanted to be the first to voice what they were all thinking. Finally, the Minister of Galactic Affairs spoke, her voice quieter than usual. Then the true war was never between us and the Zelnari. The words sent a chill down Keldrin's spine. No one countered her claim. No one argued. Because deep down they all knew. They had been fighting the wrong enemy. And the real one had just arrived. The weight of unspoken truths settled over the chamber like a gathering storm. No one dared to move, as if shifting in their seats might somehow make the situation worse. Admiral Keldrin remained at the center of it all, his own pulse steady despite the gravity of the moment. They left. A voice finally broke the silence. Director Veer of Coalition Intelligence, his expression unreadable. The human ship arrived, dismantled an entire war fleet in moments, and then simply left. Keldrin nodded. Yes. Veer's fingers drummed against the table, slow and deliberate. That doesn't concern you. It does, Keldrin admitted, but not in the way you think. The council exchanged glances, waiting for him to elaborate. They didn't stay to negotiate. They didn't demand tribute, territory, or even recognition. They didn't treat us as enemies, but neither did they treat us as allies. He let that thought linger before continuing. Their message was clear: do not seek us out. which, naturally, the Minister of Galactic Affairs murmured, means someone will. That, more than anything, was inevitable. The coalition spanned countless worlds, each governed by its own ambitions and fears. Someone somewhere would see the arrival of the humans as an opportunity. Someone else would see it as a threat. Neither could resist the temptation to act. Keldrin's gaze swept across the chamber. You all feel it, don't you? This shift. No one spoke, but the silence was answer enough. The Zelnari had been the great shadow looming over the galaxy for decades, the existential threat that had united entire civilizations against them. Now they were broken, and in their place, a new uncertainty had taken root. The true war had never been the one they had fought. It had always been the one waiting in the darkness, unseen. The supreme strategist leaned back, exhaling slowly. So what do we do? Keldrin hesitated. He had fought wars, negotiated truces, navigated the treacherous waters of diplomacy. But this was something else. Nothing, he said at last. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Nothing. Vere's voice carried an edge of disbelief. You propose we simply sit idle, while the most powerful force we've ever encountered disappears into the void. Yes, Keldrin said, his tone firm. Because if we make the wrong move, if we seek them out, provoke them, try to understand what they are before we're ready, then we may not survive the answer. The murmurs quieted. The Minister of Galactic Affairs folded her hands together. And if we're already too late? Keldrin had no answer. The humans had left. But that didn't mean they weren't still watching. The meeting adjourned in uneasy silence. No formal conclusion had been reached, but that was to be expected. No one knew what the correct course of action was, and the fear of making the wrong choice weighed heavily on all present. Admiral Keldrin walked the dim corridors of the Coalition Command Station, his mind occupied with thoughts he could not voice. Outside the reinforced viewport, the remnants of the fleet hung in the vastness of space, battered but intact. The war was over, yet it did not feel like peace had been won. It felt as though something vast and unseen had simply stepped over them, disinterested in their conflict. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. A quiet chime from his personal communicator broke his thoughts. A direct message. The identification codes were unfamiliar, but his instincts told him this was not something to ignore. He found a secluded alcove and activated the secure channel. The display flickered, resolving into the sharp, weathered features of a Zelnari. Not a low-ranking officer, not a mere diplomat. This was one of their high war chancellors. Keldrin had studied their military hierarchy well enough to recognize the significance of this. For a long moment, neither spoke. The Zelnari's gaze bore into him, searching, weighing. Finally, in heavily accented standard, the alien spoke. You should be afraid. Keldrin did not react, though he felt the weight of those words settle deep in his bones. Explain. The Zelnari exhaled a rasping sound. We fought you because we understood you. Your tactics, your limitations, your ambitions. We calculated the odds of victory and deemed war necessary. A pause. But we did not understand them. Keldrin remained silent, letting the alien speak. They never responded to our initial contacts, not as you did. We sent probes. None returned. We sent envoys. None survived. We sent warships. The Zelnari's slit-pupiled eyes narrowed. None were ever found. A cold sensation curled at the back of Keldrin's mind. This was not the first encounter. The humans had been in the shadows long before today. We thought ourselves conquerors, the Zelnari continued. We have crushed worlds, rewritten histories, and bent entire civilizations to our will. But they, the alien hesitated, as if struggling to put words to the thought. They never sought to rule. They did not negotiate terms. They simply ensured that those who found them would never do so again. Keldrin spoke carefully. Yet they allowed you to live. A bitter, humorless sound. Not all of us. The transmission cut abruptly. No farewell. No further warning. Just the lingering weight of what had been said. Keldrin stared at the empty screen, the silence stretching long around him. The Zelnari had always been the nightmare at the edge of the galaxy. And now, Even they had woken up screaming.